So how might we shift our understanding of Black intimate futures during this pandemic moment? So this question makes me think about how I would love for us to include rest and be intentional about centering rest during this pandemic moment. Um, I think this moment showed us as a collective, as a people, that just how unsustainable much of our current work and grind culture is. And also further show just kind of like how disproportionately it impacted Black people, particularly Black women, trans and non-conforming folks. And I really want a world that values and encourages not only healthy rest practices, but also values us when we're not always in movement, right? And I, I think I'm particularly as it relates to like my work and thinking about Black girls and Black girlhood. I think there's a way that we value, come to kind of collectively value and exceptionalize Black girls for being always in movement and always having to be exceptional. So I'm thinking about Sha'Carri Richardson and just how much this moment we're able to praise her and be able to praise, Black girls with dyed hair, with bright color hair and long nails, Black girls who I see disproportionately impacted by, kind of being school push out, right? So how do we kind of like value and protect Black girls and value their rest and value them even when they're not having to be exceptional, right? So what do we do to make sure that Sha'Carri Richardson is just not this one moment or this one time where we find ways to kind of value Black girlhood. Um, and also making sure that we remember what it means to value Black girls even when they're not the greatest athlete, right? So the Black girls that we see every day in class, Black girls who are in our neighborhoods, how do we kind of like value them? And so I think for me, shifting and reimagining a Black intimate future, includes shifting and reimagining how we've come to think about rest, how we've come to think about movement, how we've come to kind of value Black life when it's always in movement. And what would it look like to value Black intimate life, value the interiority of Black intimate life, right? And really kind of like encourage space for people to just be. Um, and I think I'm thinking a lot about, I've been thinking a lot about just stillness lately and who in this past year got to be still, who didn't have the luxury of being able to be still, um, and just kind of, what that means as far as, um, what this negotiation of Black intimacy looks like. And I think, this past year we got to see so much of we got to see just also how our intimate spaces can be seized upon, right? So um, having Breonna Taylor, be murdered in the intimate space of her home, right? Aiyana Jones, who is a young Black girl, be murdered in the intimate space of her bedroom, right? I think this past year made clear how important sustaining the self and sustaining the intimate self is, but also how that is still very much something that Black folks don't get the luxury and the chance to access, like even our intimacies and the ways that we are still with ourselves, is something that is easily um, seized upon and taken away from us. And so I really want to, in talking about Black intimate futures, I really want to think about stillness and access to Black interiority and the access that Black people don't have to be among ourselves and with ourselves. Um, and to rest. So that's what I'm thinking about.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. You know, in some ways, maybe what I have been thinking about relates to a lot of what you've just said, Amoni. I wasn't necessarily sure exactly how to enter into this discussion, but I tried to just think about some of the research that I've done and am currently doing to engage with this question about Black intimacy. So I guess there's sort of three terms that I have been working with. You know, one is related to what I've been calling intimate antagonisms, but again, just thinking about intra-communal relationships, as well as conflicts that happen amongst us, the kind of sometimes competing freedom dreams, right? That also create conflict within, again, community, however that's defined. So that's one term. The other term would be incorporation. So by that, I'm really thinking about the way that especially radical practices by Black people, whether they be in the everyday or even in organized spaces, but the way that those perspectives, those energies often get incorporated into the mainstream as a way of neutralizing their radical potentiality. So that's the second. And then the third is a concept I'm still trying to make sense of, but that's around nostalgia. And so really thinking about, especially in times of crisis, the emergence of nostalgia, a longing for a fantasy about the past as a way of sort of dealing with the present and trying to posit some sense of what we want in the future. So there's both the possibility and of course the dangers of that nostalgic thinking. But so the larger point then that I'm trying to get at is, you know, what does it mean to center Black intimacies, Black people's relationships with themselves and each other, as opposed to always beginning our analyses at the color line. So I think that in some ways we're seeing, for example, you know, responding to sort of white supremacist, xenophobic, reactionary attitudes and policies around critical race theory, for example. What does it mean, right, for us to, again, center trying to argue across that particular divide when there is a conception of being, of thinking, of society and sociality that's rooted in, as we know, settler colonial, anti-Black, xenophobic, transphobic, right, that are rooted in those discourses and in those forms of power. So it's not about ignoring the realities, of course, of racial capitalism. I think this is what Black expression and Black study is always grappling with. But at the same time, there's so much that happens between us, right? Which has often been the space where people are working through a variety of questions. So, you know, as we theorize, write about, or engage in, right, these various intimate practices, they are absolutely about care for the self, about care for community, but oftentimes they are spaces where people are negotiating, right? The various asymmetries of power that we're all grappling with. So I think, you know, especially for, you know, someone like me who's interested in culture and doing sort of cultural criticism or thinking about expression and aesthetics and so on, this question of how we think about, again, what constitutes a community, and then also how we think in more complex ways about the dynamics of intimacy, right, that occur within our own communities. And that's both with the view to acknowledging, right, harm that happens amongst us and between us, the ways that, again, an abolitionist politics or praxis, let's say, also needs to address and account for the fact that there is a real need to address people who are dealing with, right, immediate harm in their lives, in their homes and in their communities. And so when I'm thinking about what a lens, right, what a framework that really does center Black intimate lives in all of the messiness, right, of that expression, that there is a way of also really thinking about how our attempts at performing life, right, our attempts at this thought experiment called life is also always grappling with the complexities that we're all facing. So again, because of the pandemic, again, as Amoni was saying, the spaces called home, spaces of dwelling, spaces where there is some kind of recognition, right? That's not only in the dominant terms, that we've all been recognizing the importance of being able to have those spaces, also recognizing when they don't exist. I think there's so much to say about this, also, thinking about what it means to be Black in the academy, the way that people generally move for a job. What does it mean then in terms of the creation of community? Who are we talking to? If there's immediate needs for care, how are those things being addressed? How are our thoughts and thinking also being developed in relationship or not, and conversation with each other? So again, this question of where we're at, from whence we speak, and so on, I think continues to weigh heavily. So I feel like I'm saying a lot. I think inside of that, there's also a reckoning that, we also really are wanting and needing to take seriously, especially thinking about, our varying degrees of exposure to precarity. What it means to also be thinking about that as we are talking about Black intimacy and Black intimate spaces. I am a Black woman and also a tenured professor at UC Santa Barbara. So that does make for a different experience, right? And that doesn't mean discounting or valuing more or something like that, but there is a real need, right, to address and to acknowledge these kinds of issues between us. So I think this is why ultimately this question of the sort of intra-racial, right, in conflict, in cooperation, in all of its various guises, I think is such a central place from which to start to think about the various kinds of crises that we're confronting. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much to both of you. I have like five sheets of notes already on things that you said. Thank you so much for everything that you said. And, again, I want to think about, my point of entry as a Chicana scholar, as a Chicana feminist scholar, and thinking about the, intellectual genealogy of Chicana feminism would not be what it is without Black feminism. So that is always such an important part of the research, of the work, right, of the larger work in and out of the classroom, on the page and off the page. And so when I was thinking about intimacy in these different iterations or contexts, I started thinking about pedagogy immediately, maybe because I just taught this huge class like 520 students, and I kind of felt like a lack of intimacy in terms of, being able to have these really intense conversations about gender and race and class in such a disembodied way was really strange for me, especially because I do teach the first kind of class of its kind in Chicano Studies, which is a class on Afro, Latina, Latino, Latinx diasporic performance. And so this class is literally about African diasporic embodied practices in the Americas. And so doing that via a virtual platform was incredibly challenging because I teach the history, but also I'm a dancer and a musician as well. And so teaching about improvisation and sort of even call and response, and the students and I sort of laughed, and when we had guest artists, thinking about the lag of Zoom, of the Zoom, so you're always sort of off, and so kind of theorizing about that sort of lapse in time. And also, again, thinking about teaching about racialized sexuality, about Afro-Latinidad, about gender and performance at this particular historical moment when, as we know, Black and Brown communities have been disproportionately affected. So I think about the relational legacies between Black and Brown communities at this particular moment. I also kind of think transnationally. 2020 also happened to be the first time that Afro-Mexicans were accounted for, where there was an opportunity for them to self-identify as Afro-Mexican or Afro-descendiente on the census, right? And so it was a huge historical moment. And then thinking about how that sort of travels north in terms of how those kinds of conversations play out in the classroom. So it becomes this conversation that moves beyond Chicanas or Latinx students as allies in terms of the struggles of Black folks, but also, many of them really did some family history and really started, researching their own sort of Afro-Latinidad in these really powerful and really, really critical ways, which meant that they had to, delve deep into internalized racism in their own families. So, thinking about anti-Blackness in relation to indigeneity was also really a really powerful conversation. They have been powerful conversations to witness. So thinking, I was thinking a lot about the intimacy of the US-Mexico border in terms of how discourses of racialized identities travel. I was thinking about lots of things. And I was also kind of thinking about the figure of Kamala Harris as being, as being chosen by Biden to take on such an astronomically complex issue that is immigration, and the ways in which she was sort of deployed to Guatemala and then sort of, recorded saying really intense comments about, don't come, do not come. And again, this racialized, gendered figure, then, witnessing the attack by folks, of, the ways in which what she said was perceived as, right, anti-immigrant, anti-Latinx immigrant specifically. So just thinking about those really kind of painful moments in which there becomes a strategic kind of line drawn in the sand that is absolutely, imbricated in the history of this country, in discourses of, divide and conquer, not to use that phrase flippantly at all, right? Just kind of to think about those really complex histories. And, again, thinking about these different borders, not just geographical borders, but borders, socioeconomic borders, which again, we've seen how the pandemic has illuminated and put those borders into sharp relief in ways that are painful when we see it, in the faces of our students who are, embarrassed to turn their cameras on because they're embarrassed of where they live and how many people live with them, and all these kinds of really, you know, the exposure of their intimacy, of their intimate spaces, of their home spaces, of their inter and cross-generational spaces of dwelling, right? And this to invoke what Felice said about dwelling, right? These spaces that, you know, they would be so embarrassed and, you know, just thinking about where that comes from. And so, but also, you know, of these multiple borders of access to technology, of access to space, access to healthcare, access to all kinds of human rights, these borders as spaces in which racialized subjects are surveilled, you know, incarcerated, punished. I think, you know, thinking about how to talk about that in the classroom. I don't know why. I think just because I taught this huge class, I've been thinking about teaching a lot and pedagogical, you know, methodologies of how to think about the classroom as that kind of, as a different kind of intimate space, and how, especially when we are able to return to the physical classroom, to be back, you know, in the, to revisit that kind of materiality, how that's going to affect how we talk about all of these issues, how that's going to change. And again, how, you know, how Amoni said that, you know, that if there's anything, right, that that the pandemic has taught us, it is how our work, how many of the practices that we engage with, that in the ways in which we challenge our bodies is unsustainable. And so I think it'll just be kind of really interesting to think about how that, you know, plays out in the classroom once we're allowed to share space, those different kind of intimate spaces, you know, with our students, as we all kind of learn to navigate the world in a different way. So I think I'm gonna end there, but again, immediately, I went to the classroom as a space of intimacy and exchange. And again, because a lot of the classes that I teach are about, you know, embodied practice, desire, performance, gender and sexuality. And so they're always sort of at the forefront of what I teach. So I've been thinking a lot about how pedagogical practices inform my research and vice versa. Or my work. I've been saying my work more than my research. I kind of like that. Just better. It seems less extractive and more generative, I think. So, so that's all I'll say. Thank you again so much for the time and space.
Thank you all so much for that. And yeah, we can open up and, like, if anything jumped out, respond to each other. And I think I did want to, I think what both of you all have been talking about has really got me thinking a lot too, especially, you know, Dr. Sánchez, you talking about, you know, just these extensions of like digital technology into our homes. And, you know, I think too, like a lot of what I've been talking about, just like with my peers, as well as this navigation of, you know, home life with work life, now that work is in our home much more than it has been before. And I think, you know, again, because everything I do is always centered around Black girls and Black girlhood, that I think, you know, just thinking about kind of how these like arms of policing have reached into the home in ways. And so there was a case of a young girl named Grace in Michigan who, you know, ends up getting suspended or taken to juvenile detention because she like missed a Zoom class, right? And so these like ways in which like the arms of, you know, the policing and the surveilling and a lot of what, you know, we already know to exist, the way that I think what I was amazed by, even though I knew it was capable of doing that, but the ways that anti-Blackness and anti-Black violence against Black girls immediately transformed and like immediately adapted into a different way of still kind of wreaking havoc on Black girls' bodies and their lives, right? So immediately there was another mechanism of punishing and disciplining the bodies of Black girls. And I think, just thinking kind of like about, the ways that Zoom has made it, on the one hand, difficult to create intimacy, but also very much in some ways like intruding on the very intimate parts of our lives, right? Like being expected to have our videos on and everyone see inside our homes, which is for many of us like a very private, sacred space. And so like what the things that this other iteration of the things that this iteration of a pandemic has asked of us, right, and has asked us to show and put on display that are very intimate. And at the same time, it being kind of difficult to kind of like create a form of intimacy, when you have like 500 students in a class, like what that looks like, and trying to do create relationships and create bonds. And I think that was really important that you brought that up, and you all brought up a lot of things, but I'll stop there because I'll talk forever. But yeah.
I know you're recording, so maybe I shouldn't say this, but as it's just us and we're talking about work, school, classroom, a lot of what you all said was really interesting to me. I had this idea. I haven't done it for all the people who are listening, but I had this idea of, it would be word of mouth. I would create this special seminar, and Black students would be invited to take it. Each class session, we just walk to the beach and we would sit there and breathe and look at the ocean. And then I was saying to myself, okay, but how do you evaluate? You got to give them a grade. Is it a disservice that you didn't teach them something? But then I kept saying to myself, UCSB sits right there. We could just walk to the beach and be together breathing with each other. And of course, that's deeply meaningful and a very powerful experience. So there is something that is, again, this powerful reminder, thinking about the classroom, how is it defined? The pandemic meant that people had to figure out how to do this online. No training, no compensation, nothing at all. But again, in a moment, the institution, of course, redefines what the classroom is. And of course, we all adapted to that. And, there's grumbling, there was complaining, but there was very little, let's redefine the classroom. What is that actual space? And so there is still that part of this experience, is again, that reminder. The institution clearly didn't know what to do. They were in some ways like Mr. Krabs from SpongeBob, like, save my money. And yet, those of us who are otherwise in the position of doing that work or that labor are still trying to figure out what it might mean to take that back and to redefine those practices in ways that are liberatory, right, for us. And sort of a lot of the motivation behind the reason that we do what we do. So just as Amoni, you're sharing this story about the girl in Michigan and the way that the police infiltrate Zoom to, again, maintain its efforts at, right, destruction and domination, there is also, again, do we yet feel that we also have the power to push back and to say, no, here's another definition, here's a way of reimagining. And so, Micaela, your class, again, that's thinking about performance and improvisation, again, practices that are a part of intimate communal life for Black people. And through these traditions, again, there is this sort of investment in not reproducing the same, but always in the reimagination, right, of what it means to be together and how we're together. So I like thinking about those things together.
Again, thank you so much for all that you said, and the idea of taking time to breathe, right? And of course, the sort of the most obvious representation of not being able to breathe or not being heard or not being silenced were these masks, right? And so a lot of students were kind of theorizing about, what kind of art pieces am I going to make with all these masks that my grandma made for me or that I bought or crafted myself, and just kind of thinking to write about also the kind of archival remains of the pandemic. Not that it's over, we know that. I know, and then so like breathing and stillness, I think, are so important to return to, because again, of the if there's anything that we've learned so much from this pandemic, but I always think just about the lack of stillness, the requirements to always be in motion, to always be moving in the name of of capitalism, and the way that what you said, Professor Blake, about the administration just saying, like, figure it out, we gotta save money, you gotta keep going, you gotta keep producing, and of course we've all heard critiques of the idea of, like, when things get back to normal. Well, first of all, that wasn't normal, and who wants to go back to that way of being where we weren't taking care of each other, we weren't taking care of our own bodies, we weren't being present in our bodies and in the spaces that we navigate. And so I think that is really important, and also thinking about, again, my own personal point of entry into this work and this project and the work at large. And so, in terms of all of the movement around celebrating Black life, and also, knowing when myself thinking about times that I need to be silent, right? And thinking about times when I need to, again, listen and be silent and process in a way that's generative and ask questions, but not take up so much space. And I think also, teaching students we teach them so much, but the value of self-reflexivity is something that I guess my mother really instilled that in me, to always kind of be present and to respect who you're around, and my sister as well. My sister is an architect and works a lot with this project called Design for Justice. She lives in Detroit, and so she, even when I said speak up or know when to step back, and she said, you even have to change your language around stepping, because this thinking about how ableist language, right, pervades so much of our thinking. So again, I go back to the classroom as that space in which I think we have a real opportunity to radically transform those spaces in really radical ways. I'm like excited, I'm cautiously optimistic, but I'm also really excited to I think, and in imagining ways to redefine different intimacies of the classroom. But yeah, I think we can radically transform what that looks like. Recording these lectures for this 500-person class was the most disembodied, strange experience, because I wasn't even talking to anybody. I was just professing, which is so antithetical to how I am in the world. And so it was very difficult. I didn't even have a pet. I didn't even have another heartbeat in my apartment to at least be there. So it was, especially when you are talking about, this class was on gender, and to talk about embodied experiences and embodied practices in such a disembodied way, as I said earlier, was such a trip. So again, I'm really imagining ways to transform the classroom as a radical space of exchange and intimacy, and yes, I'm imagining what that looks like. Yeah.
I just wanna, and we can jump in with each other whenever, but yeah, I love everything the two of you said, and I'm thinking about that class, Professor Blake, and I'm like, what I would love to just take a class where, a breathing practice and, being with the ocean class. Like that would be so amazing. And what I would see is just so useful for, this moment and even beyond. And, I think, like you all said, like we're at a moment where we've been able to kind of like reimagine the classroom. And so like, I guess it has been interesting to me that I haven't seen, I'm not quite sure what it might take for that like to happen, but this reimagining that we know is possible to happen. And I guess that's like maybe, and this is probably a question more of a statement, it is to like maybe like the two of you and just kind of, like what, and I like understanding like what the academy is and this like, institution that's a part of a history of other institutions that, continue to, be in this like long history of capitalist settler colonialism, and, working in the university, like working in many other places is, not, it comes along with its own form of anti-Black violence. But I'm wondering, like, for those of us who are committed to, this life of the mind, as folks say, and being in these spaces, like what might it look like, or what might need to happen, so that this imaginings that we all have don't just live here with us in these conversations, but like actually come to be. And sometimes it's really hard to like imagine anything about the university changing, but also like still, I think a part of me is still like not yet, and this could be very naive of me, not yet letting go of that possibility of seeing something different, of walking into a school and seeing 5 classes offering a breathing and ocean course. Like I really want to get to that world, and I'm imagining kind of like, and get to that world without, having to go through like the bureaucratic hoops of being like, well, how do we justify, these objectives, and we want to see all these things. And yeah, so that's not probably a well-composed thought, but just kind of like a question and things that I think about too, just as just a graduate student, who is on this way of becoming in the academy. But also, like, I think being a grad student at this moment was really interesting because we had already known kind of the precarious state we were as students who weren't yet workers. I'm sorry, my dog. Students who are technically workers, but not technically workers, and the kind of like, just kind of like how that kind of showed itself and also even reared itself even more during the pandemic. But I think, as someone who is not yet, a professor on the tenure track, I think, seeing kind of like what is possible, in these like roles that we have and like what might need to happen. And I think you've talked about it a little bit already, Felice, just kind of like these like intra-communal kind of like discussions and work that has to happen. And yeah, I guess I'm just wondering, like, from the two of you, like, what are you all seeing that like needs to happen in order for us to kind of, make sure that these imaginations and ideas we have about what the university can be outside of what we've come to know it as, like how those things are realized. And that's really lofty, so feel free to also ignore it.
I always talk about this a lot, obviously, with like Terrence and Dr. Wooten and Dr. Chua as well, right? And just like kind of thinking about how, yeah, I mean, right, and the foundational contradictions in the plural that we navigate as people of color, specifically as women of color in the academy, is exhausting, because, right, we're teaching students about dismantling institutions, yet we're working to find a place or a sense of belonging in an institution that is so hierarchically organized. It's again, lots of contradictions that manifest themselves, right? I mean, that people literally get sick, right? People get sick, and I think your reminder at the very beginning of the conversation, Amoni, about stillness, about health, about rest, I think is so powerful, because again, we're in a profession that doesn't value any of those things, about rest or time, that doesn't value process, that only values product. And so it's incredibly challenging. And also, I do want to acknowledge, that, I mean, COVID hit, during the COLA, all of the COLA Act, movement, and I think that was, working with so many graduate students. I think also the pandemic also, again, brought so many things into sharp relief. But yeah, the distribution of labor in terms of graduate students, was something that I think was really important for us to really think about. And that, that I don't think it's lofty at all. I think it's, how do we imagine the dismantling or the restructuring, which I don't know that it has to be an either or. Maybe I need to think more about those words. Maybe they're in direct contradiction, but yeah, I think that's something that we're always grappling with. I mean, I find myself always entering a conversation with, as a junior faculty member or as an untenured faculty member, right? Like, it's my whole identity. And it's not my whole identity, but the ways in which you become institutionalized in that way is quite, I mean, I lament that as well. And the same way in which, like, all of our labor, I think about how it has to be quantified in the form of a CV, or for professors, it's in the biobib or whatever, right? All these kind of narratives. And so I was telling Dr. Wooten that anything that I do, whether I perform at a reception or I facilitate some kind of community event or translate or something like that, that the first thing I think about, and I lament this so much, is that where is it going to fit in my CV, or where is it going to fit, which is so counterintuitive to the work itself, which is about being present in community, which is about, nurturing, fostering change in community and being present with the people that you're with. But the ways in which the institution has implemented such a mentality of quantifying labor in this way is something that I lament. But I think, again, we need to continue having these conversations about, reimagining, what the institution can be, what the university can be. And we know there are lots of models, the internet, globally, many of them obviously, invoked by or inspired by students, students as we think about, the history of Black studies and Chicano studies in relation to each other, and in that sort of disciplinary intimacy of being formed at the same time at UCSB was because of students, right? And that's why I think always really important. But yeah, to continue to imagine what transforming the institution looks like. I'm not, and I don't want to romanticize that at all, but I think it's something we should never let go of,
I actually think this is such an important question. And, as I'm just sitting here and listening to both of you, I've been thinking about this question. One of the things that happened, as people will recognize during the pandemic, well, we're saying pandemic, that means many things, right? All kinds of things were happening, but if you went on social media or even, being here in the academy, one of the things that people started to produce were a lot of reading lists, right? So if you want to understand what is abolition, read this. If you want to understand, right, police violence, read this. So again, there was this kind of impetus to read more or to study more. Again, this long-standing belief that we have in education as a basis for producing change. But I kept saying to myself, Baldwin, yes, was amazing and everyone should read him, but those texts we've had them, right? We've had the texts from Audre Lorde, like these things have existed and people have read them. So does reading by itself produce transformation? And if so, how, right? Or what kind of reading practice or what kind of lens does one have? Does it matter what one is bringing to that experience of reading? I had a student, I received a student evaluation one time where the marks were very, very high. Loved the class, it was so fantastic, you're a great teacher, but I'm too old to change my ways. And I've always thought about these questions around race and gender as I learned from my parents, and I just don't want to let go of them, right? So did the reading, completed the course, but it absolutely didn't lead to the kind of transformation, right, that my hope, right, or my design of the course also was intending to bring about, right? Not so much telling students what to think, but indicating a way of thinking, right, that could be transformative. So I've been wrestling with this question, what does create change? Is UCSB the same as it was in the 1960s? Yes and no, right? So how are we defining change? What is our conception of it? What creates change? How do we recognize when change has occurred? Is it that kind of goal-oriented? If you were asking about the percentage, say, of Black students or Black faculty at UCSB, you'd be horribly disappointed, right? In terms of that question. So I feel like, as we just to return back to the question that brings us together, thinking about feminist futures, thinking about intimacies and the pandemic and right, what is next for us. I think there's something to be said for, how do we really think about change? Maybe we need to also be thinking about a redefinition, of some of those terms. Yeah, never, as you can see all the books behind me, we're reading like crazy, right? Lots of lists, but has that created the kind of transformation that we imagined? And certainly, again, the desperate reactionary attempts to control education, do indicate that, of course, something can and does happen in the teaching, but of course the resistance to critical race theory is very much about a suppression of the kind of mass mobilizations that we are seeing around policing, and calls for abolition and so on. So.
Thank you both for that. That was really, really useful. I want to be mindful of your time and also your energy. And so if there are any last thoughts or comments that you have that you'd like to share, feel free. Thank you both so much for doing this. And I'm so glad. I'm glad that we got to do this for, the project, but I'm also just really glad that I got to see the two of you. It's been a while. I haven't seen you, Professor Blake, since, the defense, and Dr. Sánchez. It's been even longer since I saw you. So just kind of being in space with you all and laying eyes on you was really nice. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you both. It really was a pleasure to talk with you both. I feel very energized by the conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And rest, breathe. My choice says hydrate, rest, breathe, hydrate. Thank you.
Again, I mean, or what are the next steps for